German tanks on the Volga in the summer of 1942, less than an hour away from Stalingrad. Thus far, the Germans were proud of their achievements at Stalingrad. They hoped to impress Japan's ambassador in Berlin with them. Hitler wanted to recruit the Japanese to fight the Soviet Union. The Japanese were polite, but the answer was non-committal. During the early 1930s, the Germans and the Japanese demonstrated to the rest of the world that they had much in common. For these two totalitarian nations, there seemed something sacred in the numbers of the mob. Mesmerized, they moved like automatons. Highly industrialized, determinedly imperialistic, thoroughly disciplined, Japan and Germany armed themselves at top speed. On September 27, 1940, they reached a formal understanding. Japan joining the Axis powers. Three nations of a single mind, three demagogues. Mussolini had been the first to the fascists. Now the Axis was cemented, reaching across the world. Reaching deliberately to the most impressionable. Passing on the cult of violence. Until it became ritualized. In 1931, Japanese troops entered China, flooding through the north. There in Manchuria, they set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. The Japanese now stood at the eastern and southeastern borders of the Soviet Union with a formidable army. In 1938, there was a border incident at Lake Hassan. The following year, the Japanese tried a sharper test at Lake Kalgin-Gol in Mongolia. General Zhukov was rushed in from Minsk to take charge. In alliance with the Soviets were troops of the Mongolian People's Republic. Zhukov punished the Japanese severely in a brief but bloody engagement. It was an encounter the Japanese fought over as they removed their dead. When the Nazis made overtures, the Japanese recalled their adventure in Mongolia. The border stayed quiet, but the Soviets increased their far eastern divisions to 45. The Kwantung Army across the frontier was powerful. It had over 1,200 tanks and 1,900 planes. The intention of these specialized troops bothered the Soviets. The nearest snow was Siberia. The Japanese Air Force had demonstrated its effectiveness over the cities of China. The Soviets were afraid that these tanks would meet Hitler's panzers advancing from the west. After the United States, the Japanese had the most powerful fleet in the Pacific, and it was at home in northern waters. As a field force, the Kwantung Army offered good training for senior officers. These included Tojo and Umertsu, who later signed the surrender to General MacArthur. The Kwantung Army's designs on Soviet territory seemed ambitious. Japan's Axis partner began his war in Western Europe in September 1939. In April 1941, Japan's Minister of Foreign Affairs arrived in Moscow. The Germans were already masters of Western Europe. The Soviet Union and Japan signed a neutrality pact. With luck, the pact would secure the Soviet Union's far eastern borders should war with Germany come. Stalin and Matsuoka both anticipated Hitler's invasion of Russia. Stalin made much of Matsuoka, the Japanese minister. Later, Stalin bade Matsuoka farewell at the railroad station, in person, something he'd never done before. It was an uneasy relationship. Among the Kuril Islands, strung between Japan and the Soviet Union, the Japanese began to stop Soviet ships, and even, the Soviets claimed, to sink some. For their own purposes, the Japanese extended their triple alliance with Germany and Italy to include Manchukuo. They encouraged anti-Soviet demonstrations, recruiting former officers of the Tsar's army. In their schools, the Japanese preached the expansion of empire. The Japanese sphere of influence would extend to the Urals. Through China, to India, over Southeast Asia and into Australia, so the Soviets claimed. On November 7th, 1941, Stalin reviewed the first wartime parade in Red Square. The soldiers marched straight to the front. One month later, December 7th, 1941. Seeing the newsreels, Soviet moviegoers were outraged.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Swiftly, the Japanese flooded over Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, Indonesia, the Philippines, New Ireland, New Britain, the Solomons, New Guinea, Guam, the islands of Micronesia. Their control extended over 150 million people. Hundreds of thousands of Dutch, French, Australians, British, and Americans doomed to 4 years in the prison camps.
大東亜戦争指導の要定は大東亜における戦略拠点を
Tojo, the Japanese prime minister, preached closer cooperation with Germany and Italy. In spite of Japan's successes over the United States, Tojo warned the war would be a long one.
我が戦力を拡充しつつ独異両国と密に協力
The Japanese had their own version of Hitler's New Order and used some of the same techniques in their Asian conquests. Wholesale slaughter, torture, degradation. In 1943, the Japanese conscripted labor from the vast pool they controlled in China. Drafting them by the thousands into Manchuria, the Japanese set them to building a series of massive fortifications facing the Soviet Union. A new commander was appointed to head the Kwantung Army, General Yamada, a veteran. By August 1945, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria numbered over 1 million men. After the defeat of Hitler, the Allies held their last summit meeting at Potsdam near Berlin. It was very different from all its predecessors. The great common enemy had been vanquished. The concerns were for the power structure of the post-war world. At Yalta earlier that year, it was agreed that the Kuril Islands and South Sakhalin would return to Russia. The Soviets promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of the cessation of hostilities in Europe. They made arrangements to honor the pledge. Troops still celebrating their victory over Hitler were shipped out of Europe. Men, equipment, masses of them, trundled 8,000 miles into the strange lands of the Soviet Far East. Some of the soldiers had not had leave in 4 years. Some passed their hometowns, which no longer existed. Transportation was waiting for them, shipped in from the United States. The top Soviet commanders took up their positions, armed with code names and false identification, to help keep the size and importance of the operation secret. Marshal Vasilevsky, Marshal Meretskov, Marshal Malinovsky. Their mission was the destruction of the entire Kwantung army. The idea was to surround the Kwantung army so fast that it would not be able to withdraw into China or Korea. The plan was Vasilevsky's. They didn't take long to agree. It was scheduled for August 9th. The night before, Marshal Vasilevsky called Moscow to report to Stalin. But the Generalissimo, confident of his armies, was not to be disturbed. He was watching a favorite movie given him by President Roosevelt.
Germans surrendered, the Russians rapidly moved enormous numbers of troops and masses of equipment to the Far East, a distance of 8,000 miles. And on August the 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan.
Over 1.5 million soldiers awaited the assault signal. One wing was the First Far Eastern Front under Marshal Meretskov. The encounter battle was a slow, grinding struggle for the Soviets. Unluckily for the Japanese, the Red Army had long since perfected its artillery techniques. The effect was awesome. They broke through the border fortifications, not without loss, then moved on to envelop the city of Mutankin, a major strong point. The Second Far Eastern Front was commanded by General Maxim Porkayev. This army group's mission was the Amur River and the Japanese positions on the far bank. As the Japanese pulled back, they demolished what few bridges there were over the network of rivers. The heavy rains had turned the route of General Porkayev's advance into a gigantic swamp. bodies of water was so complex that most of the Soviet attacks were amphibious, supported by the Amur flotilla, a pocket navy. In spite of the obstacles, the Soviet covered 35 miles a day, sometimes more. It was at least the equal of anything Hitler's vaunted panzers had achieved in their headlong drives across Europe. The third Soviet group, the Baikal Front, was not expected by the Japanese. It came in from the rear. The Baikal Front was commanded by Marshal Rodion Malinovsky. Malinovsky's men faced one of the most forbidding mountain ranges in Asia, the Greater Khingan. Their mission was to cross the Khingan with all their equipment and overrun the Manchurian plain. There was a single road, reserved for trucks and tanks. The artillery and its ammunition had to be hauled by hand. Going down was as hard as climbing up. It took 3 days for the leading Soviet elements to cross and fall upon the astonished Japanese. The Kwantung Army resisted fiercely, but the Soviet armor soon broke into the plains. General Pliev, known as the Red Cossack. Pliev was famous as a cavalry commander who had raided deep inside the German lines. His mission was to march with Marshal Choibalsan's allied Mongolian cavalry unit across the parched earth of the Gobi Desert. Everything had to be carried with them: food, medical supplies, ammunition, and above all, water. Enough water for animals, machines, and 60,000 men. The latest news caught up with them en route. Pravda reported that the Japanese in Manchuria intended to fight even after the emperor surrendered. The Soviet pincers met, but the Japanese did not give in. The Red Army had developed an extensive repertoire of techniques and used most of them in its campaign against the Kwantung Army. Mobile armored columns, paratroop drops ahead of the advance, massed artillery. It even ran its heavy tanks along the railroad tracks. It could muster overwhelming force against the Japanese wherever and whenever it chose. In mid-August, the Japanese regrouped. They were still full of fight. It was no easy victory for the Red Army. The Soviets launched a simultaneous operation against southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. They came silently at night, with 60,000 men in 100 ships. The ensuing battles were savage and lasted for 3 long weeks. The Soviet Navy, meantime, closed 5 Korean ports, cutting off the Kwantung Army's escape route. The Navy put its Marines right on the piers, 10,000 of them. Airfields deep in Japanese-held territory were captured by direct beams. With fighter escorts, airborne troops were simply landed right on the fields, taking them almost before the defenses could report an attack. one of the captured airports, a Japanese transport had landed before the pilot realized his mistake. When the plane was finally brought to a halt, the door opened on none other than the Emperor of Manchukuo, Henry Puyi. The Emperor of Japan had already surrendered. Some fanatical Japanese took off their uniforms, continuing to snipe at the Soviets. One by one, they were subdued. Their equipment had been smashed, their fortifications demolished, their pride humbled. By the time it capitulated on September 3rd, the Kwantung Army had lost 700,000 men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Japanese emissaries signed the surrender documents aboard the Missouri, as did the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets. The Soviets had liberated many Allied POWs. Now it was time for all the soldiers to go home. American, British, French, Australian, Russian. Only the differences in their uniforms distinguished them. At a time like this, there was no language barrier. The relief was universal. But some would never go home.
Home is something that you carry in your head. It lives within the heart. They cloud my eyes everywhere I look. As long as life is mine for me to own, I'm always going home.
They had fought the last battle of the unknown war. Peace had many blessings.
So I know, no matter where I go, I'm always going home.
Our final story, a soldier of the unknown war. A tribute to the 20 million Soviet citizens who died between 1941 and 1945. It was made by Roman Karman, greatest of Russian film documentarians, who thought it was the most significant project of his life. When it was finished,